Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sean Liang, and today I'll be discussing with you the significance of Japanese theater. One of the oldest surviving forms of Japanese theater is Noh. Developed by Kanami Kiyotsugu in the mid 1300s, this theater form is a highly stylized form of dance theater, which often involved actors wearing masks as they danced around the stage. It was derived from classical Japanese literature and the samurai philosophy, as well as Confucian ideals of what it meant to be a good person. So it would often revolve around a supernatural being coming back to teach the main character about traditional Confucian values. There were usually three main actors: the protagonist, the shite, the secondary actor, the waki, and the kyogen, which would perform during the interlude. These three major characters were often accompanied by an orchestra and an octet of chorus. One major event that heavily influenced the Japanese Noh was the Onin War, which waged from 1467 to 1477. And this war heavily destabilized the Yamato aristocracy, and of course, with it, the major Noh troops that would perform for them. This allowed more marginalized tropes, including amateur tropes and existing professionals that hadn't really been major in the scene, to kind of fill the void as the major four kind of like faded into the background or took sides during the infighting. Later on, after the war, certain warrior lineages that had participated in the Onin War began to supplant the imperial lines, and they would essentially take their own Noh tropes and they would go perform Noh. And in this way, they kind of asserted themselves as being part of, the prestigious class that was capable of holding these performances. Of course, because they were trying to show off that they were, in fact, I guess, central pillars of this samurai spirit that they were trying to embody. A newer form of Japanese theater that descended partially from Noh, actually, was Kabuki. Developed by a priestess, otherwise known as Miko in Japanese, by the name of Okuni no Izumo in 1603. She went from town to town, basically, performing, and in doing so, she came up with this new stylized form of theater, where she would take inspiration from the wandering samurai clans known as the Kabuki. And she would take after their violent, almost ostentatious nature, and she would translate that into her art with this super wild dance form and this overly aggressive, but at the same time almost monotone way of speaking that would capture the attention of audience members as they passed by, and thus contribute money to her cause. This was traditionally a full female cast and eventually came to include males, but would later be replaced by a mostly male cast because of a decree by the government of the time, the Tokugawans. In 1629, the Tokugawan government had come to associate the kabuki performers with prostitution and improper morals, right? Because they were taking after the rogue samurai, the kabuki, and performing these wild, provocative theater dances, basically. And the Tokugawa said, nope, that was enough. And they banned female performers from performing the kabuki. So, in order to fill the void that they had made, because they were getting so popular, the Tokugawans brought in the wakashu, which were young male actors who would then perform the female roles in these kabuki performances. Unfortunately, the wakashu were also heavily prostituted, leading to their ban a couple decades later in 1652. This led to the kabuki theater art form being completely infiltrated by adult male actors. And in the stead of the okuni and the wakashu, they instituted these specified male actors called the onagata, which these male actors would basically live their entire lives as women in order to perfectly emulate the feminine spirit that they were trying to present on theater. So, a lot of the times, these onagata would actually basically be treated completely as women despite being men. And one thing this really did was it allowed the Japanese in the early like 1700s to explore gender identity, which was not a common thing, especially back in the day in Western cultures. The Japanese did not have this same issue. They basically allowed the theater, whether they intended to or not, right? They allowed the theater and the actors to explore the boundaries between men and women, gender ideals, gender identity, and actually sexual identity too, because part of being the ideal woman meant to be basically the ideal woman for a man, which sometimes included sexual acts. These art forms allowed the Japanese to preserve their cultural identity over the course of 700 years, from Noh and its counterparts up to the slightly more modern kabuki, and even into the present day, they still perform these performances as true as they can to the original literature. So they're basically a little time capsule that preserves over 700 years of traditional Japanese and Confucian ideals into the present day. And thank you all for coming.